if psychology and pop culture had a baby, they'd call it Shrink Tank.
There is a sort of pendulum that's swinging back and forth where we kind of go from one extreme.
And I think there's an element of truth to
Because
this.
I have something interesting later in the show that will make you feel very weird. From Nashville and Charlotte, this is the Shrink Tank Podcast. And welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. We have a fantastic show for you. Our trending topic today is the psychology of school shootings. That's in our second segment. But first, we're going to meet our Charlotte panel. Dr. Emma Kate Wright is out again today. I'm beginning to think she don't like us no more. But Dr. Frank Gaskell is with us still.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's good
Still
or bad.
here.
And Frank, we're going to talk about school stuff in the second segment. But if you reflect on your school life from the time you were in kindergarten up through college, what was your favorite school that you ever went to? Or what was your least favorite school you ever went to and why?
The least favorite school I went to was a private school in Eastern North Carolina, where I was on a daily, consistent basis from the 4th grade through to the 8th grade, was bullied, ignored, not invited to anything, physically bullied. I'm an only child. I had 0 friends. I didn't even have a dog.
Oh,
It was the worst.
the
I
worst.
find that hard to believe.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like Frank.
Doesn't sound like Frank.
Yeah.
None of that.
No.
And then it all turned around.
Sure. Yeah.
In 1 week's
Completely
time.
different.
All it took was 1 week.
1 week. What was your favorite school you ever went to, Frank?
My favorite?
Yeah.
Probably there's a school I went to in Esfahan, Iran called the Airport School. And it was a really diverse group of kids and kind of loosey-goosey. It was very, very fun, very different.
That's quite the name. The airport school.
Well, it was a
you know.
school built on an airport. So,
My favorite school was the DMV. It was good.
Yeah.
Liked it a lot.
My favorite school
Anywho.
was the bus terminal school. Wasn't quite as good as the airport school. That was for the rich kids.
Okay. There we go.
And Jonathan Hedderly's here. You've already heard from him. He's our certified Asian. He rounds out the panel. Jonathan, same question. Favorite or least favorite school and why?
Least favorite was probably my middle school, Whatcom Middle School in Bellingham, Washington. I think it's more because it was just middle school, and middle school is just sort of a weird time, and that was still really in the midst of my parents' divorce and just a lot of family dynamics with my brother who lived with my dad and a lot of socioeconomic struggles. But after that, high school, college, graduate school, seminary, I liked them all. Nothing really stood out. I'm not the type of person, and part of this was just wasn't particularly thoughtful about it, and another was just didn't maybe have the economic means. I just kind of went to schools that accepted me. I'm like, okay, like I applied to one college, I got in.
And you went.
The first day I went there for freshman orientation, which was a week before classes began. It was the first time I'd ever set foot on campus. Applied to seminary grad school a week before classes started, got in, showed up, got my books, then went to my class. Like, that's just sort of how I've rolled a lot of my life when it came to
So
school.
weird.
That's awesome. You know, my favorite school that I went to was actually my undergrad alma mater, James Madison University, which I loved. I loved that school. But to be honest, probably the richest time of school was where Frank and I met, which was at UNC Chapel Hill. And
Not airport school?
not airport school or bus terminal school. I will tell you this. We were talking last week about Howard Stern, and part of what we talked about is how he has this community of, he calls them the Whack Pack, all this sort of cast of characters. That was Chapel Hill, man. When I think about that time, it was like the Whack Pack. It was this community of just an assortment of the most interesting humans that you could imagine.
It was so bizarre when I look back on it, just so strange.
Yeah. So when I think about it, it really, I love the thought of that time. It was just such a weird, fun, cool experience. So That would be my most favorite experience. Well, each week, Jonathan trolls around the internet and he finds a great story for us of psychology in the news. It's our first segment that we call
Being Human.
Why does political satire tend to be liberal? Well, underlying psychological traits could explain why political satire tends to be liberal. The need for cognition, which is a psychological term used to describe the enjoyment of thinking and analyzing problems, could help explain the differences in humor appreciation between liberals and conservatives. This is according to new research in psychology of popular media culture. Political conservatives tend to score lower on a measure of need for cognition, which is related to their lack of appreciation for irony and exaggeration. So, Frank, what do you make of the liberal media or irony being something that's more served to the liberals than the conservatives?
Well, this is another article where I've never even would conceive of this as a research question, but it's really cool. And it makes sense for me in that I think conservatives tend to operate on belief. They're less curious. They're more kind of black and white. Things are just so fairly rigid. And so that they don't have the mental flexibility, I think, to understand what there's one term in here is called incongruity-based humor. And that's really what humor is the juxtaposition of two things that don't really go together. And also you look at conservatives tend to be more conservative religiously. So a lot of the comedy topics are not going to necessarily stick the landing with this community of people.
So you said that conservatives are more likely to be conservative religiously. That makes sense, Frank.
Jeez. Man, I'm back in 5th grade. Oh, God. Don't hit me.
I have been fascinated with this because if you look at on television especially, the great political satirists and the great comedians, at least in late night and in that space, they all have a liberal sensibility. And there's this kind of easy answer that, well, Hollywood skews liberal and that's why. But it's not just that. It's something more. So if you look at Jon Stewart and now Stephen Colbert and Seth Meyers and, Samantha Bee, et cetera, they tend to come from a liberal perspective. And when conservatives have tried to do it, with very few exceptions, it hasn't worked. Like Fox News has had a comedy show-ish, kind of similar thing. It just doesn't work. A lot of it's something about whether it's not just about the hearer of it or the receiver of the comedy. It's about the person who is formulating the comedy. There's a different mind at work there. And so Jon Stewart has this ability to kind of he still does, but not on the air anymore, connect these dots that you would not normally connect. There's a mental flexibility there. There is a willingness to kind of go into territory that might be a little more risque or taboo. So yeah, I think there is something to that difference. I'm a big student of American comedy. And so that has always fascinated me about like, why do conservatives have a harder time pulling this off? And I think it's not just conservative audiences. It's more of it's whether the person who's delivering it is conservative or liberal.
Well, and I love how it talks about some of the conservative statements as like, I don't want to have to think too much to get a joke. Right. And personally, the most gratifying jokes I ever tell are ones that there's somebody in the room that just doesn't get it. Like,
yep.
they can't connect the dots. That's not how humor operates with them. And for me, it's like, oh, I just told a joke to myself. That's pretty rewarding. But, Dave, one thing you've talked about in the past is you tend to find yourself pretty moderate, kind of right down the middle, and maybe you swing a little left or right on various things. And I have this theory about liberals and conservatives that I think kind of reinforces that you're a moderate, because you really do appreciate humor and satire. And so I think that leans more towards that creative, flexible thinking part that you have. I've always had this theory that conservatives really like inspirational, happy films, which I think you fall for, that I find a little too sentimental at times. And I think that's really where some of that more conservative kind of part of your brain that just likes a happy ending, likes everything to wrap up and work at the end, that I find taxing at times.
Yeah, me
Well,
too.
I like both. Yeah, I mean that's it. I like Game of Thrones and I like This Is Us. You know, I like all of that. Yeah. So I do. I do agree. I think that does tap into the more conservative. We want kind of the sentimental, we want the happy ending, that kind of piece of it. But yeah, it's fascinating. I'd love also for us to think about when it does work, when there is a conservative comic, what makes that work? For example, like Dennis Miller, or I'm hard pressed to come up with a lot of others. I mean, Jim Gaffigan's probably a little. He's a pretty devout Catholic. I think he's a little more on the conservative side. When it works, like, what is it about them that makes that work? That's a fascinating conversation, and we'll maybe come back to that. I always like to talk about sort of what makes things funny and why things are funny and that kind of thing. We're going to shift gears and talk about our trending topic, which is the psychology of school shootings. And we're talking about this. It's a heavy topic, of course, but because there has just been an inordinate number of school shootings this year, and by at least one count, 44. By the way, I've done many continuing ed trainings, and I talk about violence and risk assessment. And it used to be a pretty conventional thing for me to say, there's been about an average of one school shooting a year for the past 30 years. That was kind of a typical line from that training. Now we're looking at double-digit numbers of shootings. We're looking at numerous people killed in this past year. I think we've had 9 deaths, 29 injuries, 3 suicides. So it's something that is... There's a qualitative difference in terms of number, and there's also a quantitative difference in terms of number, and there's a qualitative difference in terms of some of the aspects of the school shootings. And we're going to talk about that. Another part of the reason why we're talking about it is because you guys are in Charlotte, and just recently there was a shooting at UNC Charlotte, which is just down the road, about 20 minutes from the Charlotte studio. And many of us have known or have some connection with people that were directly affected by that shooting. So we're going to talk about the psychology of that. But first, let me just ask a general question. Any thoughts about why? Let's assume that there has been an increase in this. School shootings and mass shootings, both. So school shootings are a particular type of mass shooting. So the broader umbrella of mass shootings, but particularly school shootings. What's your guess about why? Frank?
I would say it's a marginalized kind of mind that gets it stuck in their head that this is how they're going to get fame, this is how they're going to get attention, because they can't get it otherwise. I don't want to just say, oh, it's mental illness. I think that brushes aside, but I think some of these people see, oh, look, that guy was on the news. We know that person's name, and they want a piece of that, no matter the cost.
But let me push back on that a little bit.
Okay,
I'm really interested more in why we feel like there's been an increase, and those things, issues of mental illness, issues of people being disenfranchised and alienated, people that might have their own stuff going on where they might want their kind of piece of infamy. Those have been there for decades. So why now?
Yeah, but
what's going on now?
We couldn't see it then. You would see a line in the evening news, a line in a newspaper, so something happened. But now you can surround yourself with the information you want. You've got your social media. You can believe in all of these things, and then it gets transmitted around the world immediately. You're famous.
You're talking about from the shooter's perspective.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Jonathan, what's your take on it? Why the increase, do you think?
Well, I think we're in a time of, like Frank and you have alluded to, great divisiveness. But I think we've also seen through social media, through 24-hour news cycle, that the rhetoric that's out there is really ramped up, and then it just continues to ramp up in a number of different ways. I- it's unfortunately quite common for me to work with or get called because a student has made some type of threatening statement or gesture at I've had it at middle school level, I've had it at high school level, and just the idea that in this climate that people wouldn't understand, that would provoke an administration or other people to respond, and yet that still happens. Every week, I probably have some type of case or consultation where a kid, whether it be elementary, middle, high school, that's threatened to kill themselves. And it's such a common everyday language that if you throw that out, and sometimes people say that, oh, you don't mean it, and that just becomes a common language that people are sort of grasping a way to get some type of attention, either that they're suffering, either that they're angry, that they don't feel heard. And then I think either the contagion aspect of just the amount of publicity, or just awareness that this is a viable option for some people, that they see this is a way to deal with my pain or my anger, and then they have the means to do so. It's like you said, it used to be one shooting a year for 30 years. Nobody in today's climate would think that, oh, this is only happening once a year. People know that this is happening, and there's threats, and people are having to do all types of drills. And now the drills have even changed from, hide and barricade yourself to run, hide, fight. So clearly every aspect of our culture has been impacted by this.
I agree with everything you're saying. I would boil it down to three things, and this is kind of a repackaging of some of what you guys have both said. But one is, we're in a culture right now that pervasively is less happy by every measure, more anxious and stressed, more depressed. And we could blame that on the political situation, or we could say the political situation reflects that. Either way, but what we know is that by any kind of measure, we're getting to be a less happy and more anxious, stressed people. The second is, because of the way social media works, and Reddit and 4chan and everything else, people can feed the beast, as it were. If someone's already having thoughts or feeling alienated or whatever, they can get into a silo, and that can be very reinforced in terms of that all the negative stuff that goes with that. And then similarly, there is a contagion effect. We know there's a contagion effect for suicide, for example, that there are pockets where if there's a couple of suicides, there often are more that follow that. When there are television shows that depict suicide, often we see increases to suicide hotlines. Same thing I think is true with this, is that more shootings breed more shootings. So I think the combination of that is really, really bad. That's what we're seeing, I think, in our culture. So I want to talk about some aspects of this. One of the things that has changed, not just in terms of the number, but what's happened, is that we're seeing this happened in Charlotte. It happened in Denver, where the shooter is stopped by a student. We didn't see that ever before that I can remember. It usually was the shooter would kill himself, or law enforcement sometimes would come along and they'd surrender or something. But now we're seeing, probably in the last year, 3 situations where a student has intervened and has slowed down or stopped the shooter. Right. We would guess that that's because the model has changed. So if you think about back in Columbine days, which that there wasn't a whole lot of thought about what to do prior to that. After that, we had Virginia Tech. The whole model was hide somewhere, barricade yourself in a classroom, go somewhere in a closet, hide. And what the thinking then became, we're putting people in these situations where they can't escape, and they're sitting ducks. So it would be like, get out if you can, but if you can't, just go barricade yourself and hide. Now it's become get away first, so run. The second thing is hide if you can't get away. And third is if you can't do either of those things, then fight. Throw something at the shooter, hit them, tackle them, all that kind of thing. Would you agree that that's been what's contributed to this kind of new thing that we're seeing where students are being in this role of subduing or knocking down the shooter? Frank?
I'd say absolutely. And because we're seeing this, we're going to see more of it. And you also have this teenager brain that says, I can live forever. So they don't really go through that process of like, I could die. They go at it. And even with some of my clients where we talk, I have somebody who's connected who's exposed to the shooting at UNC Charlotte, that these thoughts went through his mind of, I need to go attack that guy. I need to make this stop. And I mean, the upside is, yeah, they prevented some deaths. Downside is they died. So it's just very depressing to think about that.
Well, and we've seen the shift, but I don't want to overlook that the two young men that lost their lives fighting or attacking or stalling so other people could get away, that they exhibited extraordinary amount of bravery and courage and sacrifice.
Yeah,
and so
amazing.
I don't want to put it on that's an everyday occurrence or that every teen or young adult would respond to that, because I think that's very unrealistic. I think part of the reason that we've come to this kind of strategy is a couple things. One is they found active shooting trainings at schools don't seem to be very helpful. In fact, they just raise the level of anxiety and stress amongst the entire school community and population, number one, because how do you train and prepare a young kid for that? Number two, school shootings are increasing. So whatever strategies that they've had really demonstrates it's not being very effective on any level, whether it be gun control, whether it be security with schools, that if these numbers are increasing, we haven't cracked the code of how to really intervene at an early point to where we can prevent these or catch people that are considering them. But we also are hearing about people that are doing that. So even the number of attempts or people considering doing school shootings has increased, which just kind of shows lawmakers, policymakers, psychologists, we're all scrambling still to figure out what the solution is.
Right. And I don't think it's just teenagers or the teenage brain, because I'll give you an example. There's a man here in Nashville named James Shaw that grabbed the gun from the Waffle House shooter and kept many other people from being killed. I mean, the gun barrel was so hot, he has, I think, third-degree burns on his hands. He's a local hero. He really is. He's very, very well respected here and now even nationally. But his instinct was go for the guy. And I think there's something that's happened, not just in schools, but in general in our mindset of like, we're not going to allow ourselves to just hide or hope for the best. We're going to take action. And the fact that that now kids are feeling like they have to be the one responsible for that is really tragic. I mean, it is. These guys that have stepped up and have been heroic are nothing short of heroic. I mean, that is amazing. Like those guys are remarkable. But the fact that they're in this position where they feel like the burden is on me to make this thing stop is a tragedy in our culture. So Jonathan alluded.
I would also add one thing to that. I agree with you. It's not just teenage brain, but I think if we were to really look at the individuals who stepped up and went after, that you could kind of predict they have the personality to do that.
Probably, right.
That they would be the ones to be like leaders. I'm going to take charge. That's just the way they're wired.
Exactly. I would agree with that. And Jonathan referred to these drills, this practice around, we have active shooter drills. We're finding increasingly might not be that effective, number one, and two are traumatizing kids. And I think this is another way where we don't learn from history. It's like we traumatized a whole generation of kids around nuclear bomb drills, right? The whole like get under your desk, and all those kids in the era before us were just completely traumatized that the Soviet Union was going to drop a missile on them at any moment. And it didn't serve any purpose. Now we've got, though, a much more real and present possibility, but still we're traumatizing a generation of kids with these active shooter drills. So my question is, given that, what do you do? How do you equip schools to think about this well? Do you just hope for the best? Do you give them information or give them a model to think about it? Or what's the way to moving forward? Any thoughts about that?
Well, there's obviously not one home run of a remedy. There's too many smart people in America in positions of power and influence. If it was that simple, we would already figured it out. But I think in some ways, the devaluing of human life that seems to be happening in our culture, like lack of empathy, more victimization, people feeling very victimized, but also our devaluing our education system and really not matching funding and education and support for mental and emotional well-being. It's catching up to us.
Right.
So,
and you take Florida, for example, where Parkland happened, and they were willing to pass legislation to arm teachers and fund it, but they weren't willing to increase teacher pay, just as an example.
Yeah. I mean, you think about, and this is something that has popped in my head, Dave, and I don't know what the statistics are. And I'd love for our audience to maybe comment on this, is how many of the school shootings, what's the percentage that happen in public schools where they're overpopulated, underserved financially, or crowded schools or administration that are overtaxed? We already know school counselors and psychologists are vastly underrepresented, to where there's just this, every day of their life, they're in this environment where they feel not cared for, that they're either ignored or they're labeled and tagged as problematic. And, even if they are suffering and they want help, there's not a lot of means and opportunity for that. Like, our school system, by and large, is broken. Now, that's not necessarily what's causing this, but if we have to start looking creatively of how to address this suffering generation, arming teachers with guns is probably not high on the list of things that are going to be effective.
Right. Any thoughts, Frank?
I read about that UNC Charlotte shooting, and there's a company that went in there, and with a single click of a button, every door's locked. They're done. You're in there, and what they say, these shooters will come and they want to get as many people as possible. So if they go to a door and it's locked, they keep moving. So I think there's some technological things that can be done, but I'm with Hedderly in that our entire system is under stress. And you have classrooms of 40, 45 kids, one teacher, teacher stress. We're not valuing that environment. And so it allows for these experiences to happen coupled with everything else. We're not going to be able to get rid of social media. We're not going to be able to kind of get rid of mental illness or any of these other things, but it's frustrating. It's complicated. It's really depressing, and I don't know what's going to change. Other than it would be awesome if sort of our social, political, cultural world could change and be softer, more accepting, more giving. That might help, but we're so rigid now that it seems like it's a breeding ground for this kind of a thought process.
I agree with that. But the one thing that we're not saying, and I hate to be the guy to say this because it always gets, it becomes such a political hot potato, but it is the issue of availability of guns. It
Yes.
is an issue. And I am a guy that grew up with guns. My grandfather had guns on the wall above the fireplace. My dad had guns in the closet. We went out skeet shooting and target shooting all the time. I am not anti-gun, but there's a level of common sense that we've flown way past on this, and we're not able to talk about it. And there is a direct relationship between availability of guns and the number of mass shootings. There just is. And it's unavoidable. You can't get around that. And I know there are deeper cultural and systemic issues about how we're feeling about each other and how we are, rates of depression and all that kind of stuff. But one of the things we can do something about, and we don't have the political wherewithal to do it, is to have some common sense conversation about guns.
Yes.
And so that to me is something that is incredibly discouraging, because that feels like if we step back and we didn't have a political bias, a political bent, and we just looked at what the data said, just looked at the objective information, we would always conclude that high availability of guns is associated with greater rates of mass shootings. Just is.
Which is, I pin my hopes on the Parkland generation.
Yeah, I do too.
That they start voting, they get into office, and old white guys die off.
So that's the last question. Do you think that Parkland generation, the March for Our Lives, do you think it's having an impact? Do you think it can have an impact?
I do. I very much do. We have a generation of kids that are so politically involved, and that's the plus side of social media, is they can organize and they can get things done.
I mean, last year, my teenage daughter, my high school daughter, and I, we went up to D.C. for the March for Your Lives, and the fact that she said she wanted to go, that she felt she needed to make a statement that it's not just this generation coming up, it's them educating and dragging their parents and their aunts and uncles and grandparents, in some ways saying, you have created this mess for us. You have created this mess for us. You need to follow our lead. We can't just be out on an island and sort of be dismissed as young and idealistic. It's like, you need to come with us. And I think they're doing a remarkable job of that. And it's slow to drag us old farts that might be stuck in our way. But I think they have the ability to recognize that they're about creating collaboration, right? It's not about just contempt for other people. It's like, we need you to be a part of the solution. And I think that's a big difference in the past versus just protest and anger, is that they want to build alliances.
I agree. I'm in my 50s. I've never done a protest march ever, never even considered it until last year we did the March for Our Lives in downtown Nashville. And I'm incredibly glad that I did. And I do see the impact that it's having. And I think that we're going to see, rather than it fading, I think we're going to see it continue. So I'm grateful for that. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. If you like this episode, we hope that you'd give us a good rating on iTunes and tell your friends to subscribe. And if you want to give us feedback, we'd love to hear from you at feedback@shrinktank.com. For more content exploring the intersection of psychology and pop culture, you can visit shrinktank.com. And we have great articles and videos there. And we also have links to things that we recommend, like our doctor's orders products, and also social media profiles. So you can check out the description and the show notes of this video. You can follow us on Twitter at @shrink_tank and like us on Facebook. And if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, we'd love for you to subscribe. And you can find out about us wherever you listen to podcasts, so check out the description box below. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck. Our associate producer and social media guru is Mariel Butler. And our marketing intern and rubber ducky enthusiast is Sarah Bradley. For Jonathan Hedderly and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.